Welcome to Worlds Unbound. Make sure to visit the story page on Royal Road to support the author, or to follow along. Link in the description. Video created with permission from author. Toad Town, a Dungeon Core Parody. By Dosei. Chapter 41 War? My two commanders sounded their horns as my army left Toad, Castle, Town behind, and the clap of webbed feet hitting the ground reverberated through the forest, interspersed by the pounding rhythm of myself and the cavalry every time we landed from a hop, as we moved north towards Earl Sharpie's castle town. Already after just a few hours, we came across a small farmstead that, upon laying eyes on our forces, surrendered to us. Within moments, I felt their territory become added to my own domain, and I quickly sent a wave over the area and evolved all their buildings. Their crops immediately grew to thrice their normal height, and the clothes of the few peasants that lived there became like the simple clothes that my looms produced. Additionally, the kids in the farmstead immediately bypassed adolescence and grew into full adults. It seemed quite an odd thing, but so was the fact that offspring in my town were born into adulthood. As Emma would have said, it was just one of those vague magic things that were better off not being questioned. As the parents looked at their adult children in horror and confusion, my army strode further north, encountering another 3 farmsteads and a village, which were all surrendered to my domain without any casualties as well. The sun had reached its zenith when my large eyes settled upon the walls of Earl Sharpie's castle town. It was quite puny compared to my own, with his castle taking up half of its area, with the rest full of small closely stacked houses that were clearly for all the impoverished people who served him directly. Somehow, those who worked the farms under his control had better living standards. My army had only just begun the march up the hill to reach his outer wall, when we were fired upon by arrows and magical projectiles. Immediately, 6 of my footmen were crushed by a massive boulder launched from atop the castle town's walls. I sent the first of my wizards forward, and he quickly made all the ranged attackers abandon their defense when he unleashed a firestorm that blackened the stones and set fire to the nearest houses. With a powerful kick off the ground, I launched up the hill and over the Earl's walls, reaching more than 10 meters in height before I started falling back down again. While in the air, I used my appraisal on the few strong individuals assembled to defend the castle against my force. Name: Mike Boulder Carmichael. Occupation: Earth Sorcerer. Species: Subhuman. Level: 40 of 100. Alignment: Underpaid and overworked. Faction: The Earldom of Sharpie Inkle Johnson. Name: Heiner Carmichael. Occupation: Captain of the Earl's Elite Guard. Species: Subhuman. Level: 32 of 100. Alignment: Unflinchingly loyal and overprotective of his younger brother. Faction: The Earldom of Sharpie Inkle Johnson. Name: Monroe Gilfroy Gilbertham. Occupation: Tax Collector. Species: Subhuman. Level: 27 of 100. Alignment: Greedy and cowardly. Faction: The Earldom of Sharpie Inkle Johnson. I didn't spot the Earl anywhere, and it seemed he was the only one I need to actually defeat, in order to take over all his lands. With a colossal boom, my Toad Lord vessel landed atop the outer wall and tore its way through it, creating a massive rift that my army could easily move through, though I flung my tongue out in a few quick slashes to widen the gap more, such that they could enter 4 footmen abreast. My cavalry jumped over the wall with ease, and not sooner had they entered and gotten into the fighting than the taxman and Boulder Sorcerer lay dead. The guard captain went into a furious rage and managed to pull one of the cavalrymen from his mount and stabbed his over and over until he stopped moving, but then he was quickly swallowed by the slain cavalryman's toad mount, his screams abruptly silenced with a loud crunch. I had my soldiers fan out and secure the area, while I went towards the castle itself and broke down the portcullis and the large wooden gate behind it, with just a few slaps of my immensely powerful tongue. As I emerged into the throne room, I found the Earl surrounded by servants and a few loyal guards. Upon seeing me, most of them fled, though the Earl was incapable of fleeing his enormous throne, as his body was so bloated from excess gorging of food that his own 2 legs could not carry him, nor could his spindly and doughy arms pull him from his seat. His eyes were entirely obscured by a massive forehead pouch that seemed to have only grown along with the rest of his body. I used my appraisal on him and was disappointed at what I saw. Name: Sharpie Inkle Johnson. Occupation: Earl. Species: subhuman. Level: 16 of 100. Alignment: lazy, greedy, and gluttonous, but believes he has the God-granted mandate to rule. Faction: the Earldom of Sharpie Inkle Johnson. Unlike my proud Toadskander, this man was too weak and indulgent to rule. I did what I knew had to be done, and flung out my tongue, which pulled his entire body and thrown from the ground and straight into my awaiting mouth, where I swallowed them both.
Congratulations! For defeating Earl Sharpie Inkle Johnson, you have absorbed all his territory and assets into your domain. All of his former churches now revere you, and all his former servants and citizens are now your minions.
Warning: all nearby kingdoms and religious cults have now taken notice of you and are hostile towards your burgeoning kingdom. You may yet turn some of them into your allies through diplomacy and bribery, but certain kingdoms and cults will be impossible to turn into allies. Warning: the Church of Light has branded your kingdom a den of heresy, and has launched a crusade to defeat you and restore their perverted churches within your territory. That was unlikely to be good, I realized, though my forces had easily defeated Earl Sharpie, so I wasn't too worried. After allowing my army to rest for a bit, I picked the second commander and decided to make him the lord of the conquered castle town. Surprisingly, the first commander seemed not to mind, though. When I read his mind, I realized why. These worthless maggots will be whipped into proper fighting shape thanks to my ruthless drills and harsh but laced with kindness rebukes of all their failures. They will come to see me as a father figure, and will rely on me to tell them what to do, for they are lost lambs and I am their shepherd. The battlefield is the only place in the world where I belong. Every day that I am not directly responsible for someone's death is a day wasted. I pumped my essence into the second commander, the man who had snubbed all those other aristocrats by being picked over them, and as it suffused his body, he grew 2 heads taller, and his body became more reptilian than before, and a tail suddenly grew from his spine and powerful scythe-like claws adorned his scaled hands. 2 chitinous horns also grew from his brow, and his lower jaw became like a massive pouch. Where Toadskander had been elegant and deadly like a dragonfly, the second lord was potent and imposing like a stag beetle. Name: Toadus. Occupation: Lord of unnamed castle town. Species: Toadkin tyrant. Level: 75/250. Alignment: ruthlessly authoritarian. Faction: Toad Town Kingdom. I noticed that not only had he become unique type of Toadkin, no doubt due to undergoing 3 separate evolutions, but his faction now mentioned a kingdom instead of a dynasty like with Toadskander. Oh, this place needs a name, I also realized. Toadus grunted, then said, Tyrant's Denver. That sounds a bit too evil, I replied. Good. Announcement: unnamed castle town has been renamed to Tyrant's Den. After evolving the Tyrant Lord, I sent a wave of my essence over the castle town, evolving all the buildings and turning those pitiable houses into decently looking abodes. The people once again had their clothes undergo a transformation, and the children and youths immediately turned into adults, just like with the farmsteads and the village. I decided to leave half of my footmen and cavalrymen with Toadus, who himself quickly assigned worker roles to his new citizens and began constructing a new barracks and other essential buildings. To their credit, the citizens seemed to take this sudden change to their city quite well. After setting his people to work constructing the barracks, he also had them build a bakery, for no denizen of the Toad Town Kingdom could live long without bread. As I left with the remaining half of my army and their commander, a bunch of carts came from the nearby farms and were laden with fresh produce and harvested wheat for bread. It seemed that, just in the brief time since I overtook the many farms, my essence had already transformed their lands into superbly fertile soil with a rapid growth and harvest cycle. I noticed that my essence had still not recovered much since using my essence powers so much and evolving the Lord, but I instinctively knew that it was due to being so far removed from my core. I wondered if this was what Imma had warned me about. Within about 6 hours, I had marched my army back to my settlement, and as we came through the trees, I saw smoke rising from many of my buildings and heard croaking yells and chirping war cries. I shot out of my vessel and soared around my settlement, trying to figure out what was happening. After a few minutes, I found Toadskander, who was defending his castle from a mob of unevolved minions. Next to him stood my mayor, guild master, butcher, and executioner, as well as those of my sharpshooters and guard that had survived thus far. I quickly possessed my guild master, who was wielding a long sword and chopping off heads left and right. I pointed at one of the unevolved minions in the middle of the mob and flooded his body with my essence. There followed a loud pop and all the nearby minions were tossed to the ground, many of them dead before they landed. "What is happening?" I exclaimed. "My castle is being overrun by the plebeian horde," Toadskander told me. Chapter 42, Horde Mode? Still about a week prior, the unevolved minions had taken the opportunity granted to them by me pulling the army out of my settlement to launch a concerted violent uprising that saw over half of my evolved minions slain in just about 10 hours, with the survivors holding up in the castle and letting Toadskander and other powerful toadkin defend them. Strangely, my toe-caller had just stayed in his hermit's lodge and let things play out, while taking a neutral pacifist stance. Viola, the strongest wizard in my settlement, had also decided to not take part in the class conflict, though she seemed to have fought off a lot of those that sought to burn down her buffet, and now a massive tornado surrounded the building, with no one able to get in or out, although those trapped within seemed happy enough as they got to continue eating her delicious meals without any harm coming to them. Toadskander had been very diligent in my absence, erecting many bounty boards that called for the heads of those responsible for the insurrection, as well as letting many of the new visitors join the Adventurers Guild and giving them similar quests. The horde of rebel scum were in control of most parts of my city, except for the area around the Beast Workshop and Fleshcrafter's Laboratorium, as the mad scientist and Fleshcrafter fended off those that sought to take over their means of production, with the aid of Arnold the Coppershield Tortoise. I returned to my vessel and leapt atop the walls that were brimming with rebels armed with tools and simple weapons, then sent out a command that reached the furthest corners of my settlement. "All rebellious minions, return to your posts and cease all hostilities. Those who do not comply will be brutally executed with impunity." Unsurprisingly, none of the minions flinched and immediately jumped on my Toad Lord vessel, attempting to pry it apart with their hammers, rakes, picks, shovels, and trowels, though I quickly leapt in the air and fired off 24 pods of the Gnasher toads, which descended upon the horde and scattered them, allowing me enough time to breach the barricaded gate and let my army enter the city. As with my assault on Earl Sharpie's castle town, my cavalry had already leapt the large outer walls and were cleaving through the minions, sending heads flying left and right, though the tide seemed endless. Then I realized why there were so many of them. They had taken over all the houses in every quadrant of my city and were breeding at a rapid pace, somehow subverting my perk that ought to have turned many of them into toadkin, or the in-between stage of half-sub-humanoid and half-sub-toadkin. I wanted to get to the bottom of this and, like Toadskander, find those responsible, for this seemed no improvised thing. I used my appraisal on a random minion, just before his body was cut in two by a sword glaive. Name Bob. Occupation Builder Rebel. Species Subhumanoid Rebel. Level 5 of 5. Alignment Rebellious and Brainwashed. Faction The Anti-Slavery Union. Brainwashed? I said out loud, surprised at what I was seeing. The fact that he and his fellow rebels were part of a union also could only mean one thing. The leaders of this uprising were to be found in the southern quadrant. My commander urged his men forward, and they used their flimsy wooden shields and simple iron swords to push back the horde, though we had to go from house to house to clear them all out before we could seek out the root of the problem. I only hoped that those adventurers that Toadskander had sent were faring better than us. Name: Vegan. Occupation: Shadestrider Scoundrel, Copper Rank Adventurer. Species: Human. Level: 34 of 100. Alignment: Cautious and Paranoid. Faction: Toad Town Adventurers Guild. What a mess he had gotten himself into, he contemplated, as he pulled the body further into the dark alley near the district wall that led to the eastern quadrant. There was seemingly no end to the raging horde of big-eyed and big-lipped subhumans who diligently scoured each house in search of those who stood in opposition to them. Already, he had slain over 30 of them and had gained 5 levels in the process, but it had barely made a dent in their numbers. Vegan tore his dagger out of the creature and laid it fully within the shadow from the nearby house, before casting his devouring shade that caused 24 tendrils to emerge from the shadows and begin dissecting and gorging on the body, leaving no trace behind. Like with any advanced occupation, he had been taught in the ways of the Shadestrider by someone already skilled in class. In his case, it had been the infamous Bone Mask, who was said to have been granted his special powers by the arrogant triplets, whose status as deities were widely disputed, despite the fact that many temples had been built to them and depicted their disfigured and conjoined visage of 3 upper bodies sprouting from a single lumpen lower body. Vegan knew the truth, because, through his Shadestrider abilities, he could converse sparsely with the triplets and often received unique quests from them. He had already performed many assassinations that normally someone of his level should have been incapable of completing without losing his life in the process. Still, he was far from the strength he needed to be, and rumor of a legendary monster quest had drawn him to this strange city in the first place and seen him sign up with their small adventurers guild. That had been 2 days ago, and now he was somehow embroiled in a bloody insurrection. He looked at the woefully sparse quest flyer again. Quest: Death to Unionization. Type: Assassination. Required adventurer rank: No requirement. Reward: 5.000 copper tokens and a unique mount. Description: Find and eliminate the leaders of the insurrection. Their hideout is suspected as being the Union building within the Southern District. There was no description of who exactly he was looking for, which he took to mean that the issuer of the quest did not know. Vegan had decided that he would just kill anyone that looked to be giving orders to the horde of subhumans, and hopefully one of them would turn out to be the leader. Thus far, it seemed that the mob moved according to a set instruction, and they coordinated with a type of unified coordination that made him think of a hive of insects that followed the directions of a queen. Vegan broke from the alleyway and used the core ability of his class to form steps out of the shadow, allowing him to traverse up the side of the district wall and leap onto its walkway, where he quickly flung his dagger out and sheared through a guard's jugular, before invoking another ability that made a copy of his free hand emerge from the shadow of another guard and pull him headfirst into the ground, never to be seen again. There were less shadows in the southern district, due to most of its industrial facilities being spread out more, but already from his vantage point he could see where the enemy were congregated around 2 buildings, one of which looked like a shed and bore a few flags and banners that had pro-Union slogans written on them, like "No more death to dehydration and starvation," and say "No minion sacrifice." He wasn't a cold-hearted man, so he understood their plight, but instead of learning from the wealthy merchants' guild of Lillebrun who bribed their way to more rights, they had decided to make themselves stand in opposition to the rulers of their city, which had never worked out well to his knowledge. Even in situations such as when Vegan had been hired to slay a duke on behalf of the enraged populace, the aftermath was always worse than how things had been prior, as, with the power vacuum and success of the insurrectionists, a new internal struggle formed as their group split into factions, always leading to some outside force managing to take over the land with ease, killing many of the victors in the process. With a sigh he cleared his head, then leapt from the wall, allowing his shadow-borne platforms to slow his descent, so that he reached the street between large forges and anvils unscathed. No sooner had his feet touched the soil than a mob of 12 smiths and apprentices broke from their forges to defeat him. With a flourish of his dagger, and a propelling boost of a shadowy platform spawning under his feet, he launched into the air and fell upon the mob with brutal efficiency. My army had lost almost a third of its men to the ceaseless horde, but we now controlled half the northern quadrant. As more and more houses fell under my control, I ordered my footmen into the houses in pairs, so that I could reinforce my numbers. I only gained about 20 extra footmen offspring from this, but all of them had the obvious traits of being toadkin, which made me happy. I pushed ahead of my men to break a dense clump of rebels from the marketplace area, using both my tongue, flensing claws, and merciless gnash of toads. No sooner had I routed many of the rebellious minions than System appeared, holding a wooden eagle in her porcelain doll hands. She made screeching sounds as she moved the toy through the air, before slamming it right into the forehead of one of the rebels, caving his skull in with disturbing ease. It seemed that when Jan had ensured me System would not be able to damage my settlement, it didn't actually include the minions, though perhaps the rebels were an exception. Together with System and my 2 wizards who had followed my charge, we cleared out all the merchants' shops, the marketplace building, the toy maker, and the bakery. I picked one of the footmen and told him to run to the castle and report our success in establishing a foothold here, but before he could take off, a sound like repeated croaking came from both east and west, and a wave of 100+ rebels washed over us, leaving each member of my army to fend for themselves against more than one enemy. As you might imagine, this resulted in a lot of death, though my commander, the 2 wizards, System, and myself more than even the odds, devastating their coordinated assault with primitive weapons simply by virtue of our higher levels. I alone killed over 30 minions, just using my tongue and feet. My commander proved himself to be quite fearsome as well, as he cleft bodies in half with his 2-handed sword. My fire wizard was also proving himself quite a terrifying monster, as he cupped his hands and belched massive oily flames on anyone unlucky enough to be in front of him. The other wizard was a wind-based one like Viola, though nowhere near as powerful, and he simply swung his hands through the air in front of him, sending cutting blades of condensed wind to shear through the mobs that surrounded us. When I thought the horde was starting to dim in strength, another 100 or so came from the west to bolster their numbers, while we were now down to 20-odd footmen, 2 wizards, a commander, a literally immortal porcelain doll controlled by a psychotic system, and me in my toad vessel. No sooner had I begun to despair, however, than Toadscander came riding like a hero of legend atop L, whose jacket-corn horns sent bolts of electricity through the thronging rows of rebels, boiling their internals and exploding a few from the inside. The butcher and executioner came soon after, as well as the surviving guards and sharpshooters. Together, we cleared the district over the next 2 hours, and I had my remaining archers, who had hung back at the city gate due to their lack of skill with close-quarter fighting, secured the district gates from atop the walls alongside my sharpshooters. I realized then that my cavalrymen had run ahead on their own and reconnected with my lord, which was the reason they had come to our aid in such a timely manner. While we prepared to take back the east quadrant, such that I could evolve more guards, archers, and footmen, and also team up with my mad scientist and fleshcrafter, I told all available minions to get busy repopulating our forces by using the houses around us. When the first pair of footmen emerged with their offspring, I realized that my new houses had been imbued with the rare chance to increase the number of offspring possible, as the pair came out with 3 new minions in tow. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I would take back my castle town from these rebels, no matter how many minions I had to sacrifice to do it. Chapter 43, The Mastermind? Yeah, this is still about a week prior. Somehow Vagan had cleared a way through the district, after single-handedly defeating the 12 smiths that had tried to mob him. Afterwards he had stuck to the shadows and relied on his powers as a shade strider to keep him safe. The area around the Union shed was heavily guarded by the identical subhumans that had started the rebellion against the Toadkin masters of the city. By covertly using the shadows of the many guards, Vagan had traversed the open space unnoticed and gotten to the shed that seemed the root cause of the entire insurrection, given that it was run by a union of pro-freedom, pro-equality, and anti-Toadkin rebels. As he slinked through one of the windows of the primitive building that was adorned in flags and banners full of slogans, he came into a dark interior. He had scarcely had enough time to look around, when a bright flame lit up the room and dispelled all shadows around him. Vagan instinctively looked around for an escape, but found that all doorways and windows were barred by mobs of the subhumans who had surrounded the building. "A trap," he said, sighing. "And you fell right for it," said a female voice, as the crowd parted and she came walking in. It was the first female inhabitant of the city that Vagan had thus far seen, given that the rest of the city was crowded by androgynous subhuman men and Toadkin. He used his appraising eye to inspect her stats, but she was too high level for him to discover anything except her occupation. "A therapist?" he asked out loud, before someone knocked him unconscious with a hammer blow to the back of his head. My forces had pushed through the few holdouts of rebels in the Eastern District, while Toadskander and his contingent began their foray into the Western Quadrant. Our forces had been bolstered by a concerted breeding effort of all available minions, but it still seemed that several hundreds of minions served the insurrection. We had passed by Viola's buffet on the way here, but she had confirmed that she would stay put until the fighting was over, firmly taking the side of the pacifists like Toadcaller. I realized that she was only able to take such a position because there were few in my city who could challenge her and actually match her strength. When the last of the rebels were slain, I hopped over to greet the mad scientist, Fleshcrafter, and Arnold the Coppershield Tortoise. The Fleshcrafter had made good use of the many bodies they had piled high during their defense, and the area around their buildings were crawling with his children. Some were like six-legged stalk-limbed spiders and others were like 12-jointed centipedes, but the general theme was creepy insects it seemed. The scientist came up to my vessel and put a hand on my forehead, then said, "Twitilii, bring an adventurer to my—" Luckily, there were a few in Toadskander's retinue, so I called one of them over and he arrived 15 minutes later, out of breath and croaking out sputtering coughs. The scientist looked at the adventurer skeptically. "Twiddlem, this guy is in bad form. What are you gonna do with him?" I asked. He patted one of my eyeballs and then took the exhausted adventurer by his hand, guiding him into the strange domed building. Before they disappeared from sight, I saw that the scientist clutched a giant goose feather in his other hand. After a series of terrified croaking and maniacal laughter, alongside a light show that emerged out of the hexagonal plates of the domed building, the mad scientist flew out of the top of the domed shell, followed by a new creature that swooped down through the air and skated to a halt in the earth in front of me. I beheld the new creation, which stood almost 3 meters tall despite its back being arched as its bizarre goose-like head looked around, while it flapped its huge wings. Its lower half, around where its navel would have been, was a transition from steel-hard feathers to spiked reptilian scales that ended in clawed-webbed feet. Name: Bayist. Occupation: War Beast. Species: Toadgoose Griffin Chimera. Level: 55 of 100. Alignment: Calamity of the Skies. Faction: Toad Town. "I think we need something a bit stronger that can deal with a lot of enemies at once," I commented. "I can make something," the Fleshcrafter offered. I glanced at his creations and then decided that it was best to pretend I hadn't heard his offer. The mad scientist scratched his chin, then an idea seemed to come to him, and he patted Arnold on his copper shell and pointed him into the domed building, before flying off to catch one of the many-legged creatures the Fleshcrafter had made. When he had the creature in his arms, he flew up to the top of his dome and dropped it inside, before nosediving inside as well. Moments later, A loud crunch of bones and snapping of limbs followed, and from the large door of the building came a new and transformed Arnold. Name: Arnold. Occupation: War Beast. Species: Coppershield Stalker Chimera. Level: 80 of 100. Alignment: feels a bit uncomfortable with all his new limbs. Faction: Toad Town. This is more like it, I exclaimed, as I looked at the many metal-coated limbs that grew from the copper shell of the giant tortoise. It combined impenetrable defense with the terrifying reach of many jointed 10+ meters long spiked limbs, which moved around with skittering speed atop the tortoise's back. After evolving a bunch of newborn minions to footmen, the Toadkin genes strong within them as they were all the offspring of Toadkin prior to their evolutions, I also evolved another commander and more archers and guards. With my 200-strong force of soldiers, I had Arnold and Bayes push ahead with me, as my army followed in our wake and began the arduous task of checking every building we passed on our way to the southern district gate. Vagan was lying on a sofa chair as the Toadkin therapist was making him tell her about his childhood as an orphan in the slums of Lillebrunn. Between her droning monotone and the concussion from the blow to his head, Vagan was rapidly beginning to slip into the magic of her brainwashing, which slowly eroded all inhibitions he had and removed all the things that held him back from blindly following her every word. But then a massive explosion rocked the minimalistic interior of the consultation room and the therapist shot up from her chair, just as an enormous horned rabbit smashed through the back wall and sent a surge of electricity into the woman. Vagan rolled out of the sofa chair lamely and sent out spikes of shadow that pinned the therapist to the spot, and a moment later a tall, dangerous-looking figure leapt from the back of the rabbit monster and chopped off her head with a single swipe of his two-handed sword. As the Toadkin therapist fell to the ground, headless, the man came over and helped Vagan stand. Using his appraising eye, he realized just who it was that stood before him, the Lord of Toad Town, Toadskander. He was more terrifying to behold than any lord that Vagan had set his eyes upon before. Nicely done, adventurer. Come to my castle after we have wiped out the rest of these rebels, so that I can hand you your reward personally. I'm not sure I did much, Vagan replied, standing up uneasily. You cleared the way for my troops to follow, and without your instigation, we would never have discovered that the true mastermind behind this uprising was none other than a Toadkin traitor. As we fought our way to the Union building near the quarry of the Southern District, there was suddenly a change in our foe, and they became disorganized and panicked, as though the fighting spirit had been extinguished from them. Regardless of their altered mental states, we showed them no mercy and wiped them out to the very last man. No sooner had we reached the Union's hideout than Toadskander came striding towards me with a head in his grip. Behind him trotted the Jackicorn and a human adventurer, who seemed to have shadows dogging his heels like vexatious cobwebs that was stuck to his boots. I found the leader, he announced, and all the assembled soldiers chirped cheerfully. I inspected the severed head and was surprised by what I saw. Name: Grace's head. Occupation: brainwashing therapist and violent mob instigator. Species: Toadkin. Level: 1 of 1. Alignment: missing its body. Faction: the Flayed Lady. Why does she have the same faction as my flesh crafter? I wondered. Toadskander looked at me, then quickly sent a dozen cavalrymen to find the flesh crafter and imprison him on suspicion of aiding the enemy. Suddenly System came running with the other half of the therapist's body raised above her head.
Congratulations! For quelling a rebellion with the goal of achieving rights for the oppressed workers of your settlement, you have gained the Tyrant perk. Tyrant, sedition in settlements where you or any of your ruler-type minions are present is 99% less likely to occur, as your minions are too frightened by the consequences of openly opposing you and your oppressive regime.
Chapter 44, to Lillebrunn? In case you're wondering, yes, this is still about a week prior. After reconstruction and cleanup following the insurrection was underway, with the consultation clinic and Minion Help Center being razed to the ground to prevent a repeat of the heinous events that had transpired, a group of my first adventurers came wandering through the gate of my city, having finally returned from their quest to find Heckenfeld. As I occupied the guildmaster's body, I discovered that they had not only found the village of Heckenfeld and its guild office, but they had also made contact with the guild of a large city, over twice the size of Toad Town, called Lillebrunner. I'd only just finished crafting the Pacifists Guild, so the news of a major city to our southwest was a great opportunity to try my hand at some diplomacy. Finding 3 pacifist minions to evolve to diplomats turned out to be rather easy, as all the minions who had stayed in Viola's buffet sanctuary for the duration of the violent class conflict had adopted her peace-loving mindset. I picked 3 at random and put them all into the strange Pacifists Guild building, which was a conglomeration of bubbles formed from quarried stones with flowers growing from their rooftops. Selectively targeting each of the 3 pacifists, I sent my essence into their bodies, and they emerged from the strange building after an explosion of pink light and smoke. Each wore a strange knitted outfit that looked like a toad, with their faces visible from a hole just below the big bulbous head with enormous soulless eyes. Viola had joined the small viewing party, as it seemed she felt some sort of responsibility for the pacifists she had molded, and when she saw the 3 new diplomats, her only comment was, "They're adorable!" Toadskander had decided that each of the 3 diplomats should have 2 cavalrymen as bodyguards, so I quickly evolved some guards and toad mounts for the purpose. Additionally, the Lord decided that they had to travel in style, so 3 more jackacorns were shaped by the mad scientist, which the siege engine builder outfitted with massive harnesses that bore small bronze-armored houses for the diplomats to live inside, while the jackacorns took them to their destinations. I had no say in the naming of the 3 war beasts, as their names were chosen during their creation for some strange reason, but the 3 new jackacorns were called EC, Trick, and Idad. For some reason, none of them were as strong as L, the first of their kind, whose level was 100 out of 100, while theirs was 75 to 75. Additionally, they were also a bit smaller, and their horns were shorter. The first diplomat and his guards I sent to Heckenfeld, while the second was sent north in search of a port city that would grant access to a great ocean I'd been told lay that way, and the third I followed alongside of as he went to Lillebrunner. Alongside the 2 bodyguards and the diplomat came the adventurer Vagan, whom Toadskander had decided to be our guide for the city of Lillebrunner. It struck me how much Toadskander had taken charge of my settlement in my brief absence, but I supposed that my attention should be focused more on the big picture and the minutiae of governance left to my minions. Hopefully, he would be able to prevent another violent uprising in my absence and keep my core safe. Though I hoped I would never find out, I wondered what would happen to all my minions if my core was destroyed. It seemed unlikely to be anything good, as my essence, my very soul, was imbued within each and every one of them. After about 10 hours of traveling, I spotted the city on the horizon. It was definitely larger than my own, and it also had an enormous mountain behind the castle that lay at the very back of the city. In terms of utilizing the terrain to their advantage, they had me beat for sure. The king who rules over Lillebrunner and its environs was made rich by the mountain against which he built his fortress. Vagan told me and my diplomat, who insisted on staying within the strange toad costume. The adventurer was riding his own jackacorn, which had been gifted to his by Toadskander, because of his help in finding the leader of the rebels. His mount was half the size of the one my diplomat rode atop of, and matched the 2 cavalry bodyguards' mounts in size. Also, its fur was a strangely reflective black, as opposed to the silver-white, and its name was Skig. "Is the mountain full of gold and jewels, like my quarry?" I asked him. "Yes, but not only that. They also find artifacts and powerful tomes of knowledge, not to mention a cartload of experience to level up their troops and aristocrats. You see, a dungeon core resides within the mountain." Now this piqued my interest. I'd only ever heard about such cores from Emu, but had never experienced one myself. "I want to see it." "You probably won't be able to," he replied, dashing my hopes. Why not? They guard the entrance well, only letting chosen individuals enter its depths. I'll find a way to get in, I told him. Vegan eyed me curiously for a moment, then grinned. Let me help you with that. But first, I reminded him, I need to establish a peace treaty with the city. That should be simple enough if you just vow to transport goods to them. I believe Lillebrunner has a bit of a food insecurity crisis at the moment, and I noticed that the fields in Toadscander's lands are bountiful. You mean my lands? I corrected him. Aren't you just his servant? No. I am Toad, son of Todimer and Toadilda, grandson of Toto and Toadette, who are also my uncle and sister cousin. Toadscander is the lord I evolved and installed on the throne of my town. I see, was all that he replied, looking more confused than re-educated, but I just took that to mean that he had been sufficiently awed by realizing whose presence he was in. When we arrived to the massive central gate of Lillebrunner's outer walls, a contingent of armed guards halted us and asked, For what purpose have you come bearing arms into King Eskilder's fair city of Lillebrunner? Both Vegan and I were about to explain, when my diplomat emerged from the hut atop the back of his large jackicorn mount. The assembled guards took one look at his outfit and seemed mollified, a few of them even smiling. I see, said the lead guard. You have come in peace. We'll lead you to our pacifist guild at once. No sooner had the diplomat gone back inside his hut than we were being led through the city by 24 guards. Many of Lillebrunner's citizens came out to watch as we were paraded down the street, and most of their people remarked at the strange animals we traveled with the children especially wanting to ride on the back of the toad mounts, or the big fluffy jackicorn. After following the guards as they led us down the main thoroughfare of the stone city, we came to a strange-looking building that, amusingly, looked nearly identical to the Pacifists' Guild building back in my own city. Idad, the jackicorn, knelt down before its entrance, and the diplomat once again emerged from his hut, before awkwardly clambering down the ladder on the side of the animal's harness, though his big knitted toad outfit made it a rather cumbersome affair. No sooner had his squishy big costume frog feet touched the cobblestones of the road than the door opened and out walked 2 people who wore their own strange outfits, which looked like brown bear with goose wings. The animal on King Eskilder's coat of arms is a winged bear, hence why they are wearing mascot outfits to represent Lillebrunner in such a way, Vegan explained to me. I assume your coat of arms must have a frog on it. He's dressed as a toad, not a frog. I corrected him, incensed that the two be so casually mistaken for one another. As we watched the 3 animal mascots exchange words, the guards who had escorted us left to return to their posts, seemingly happy with the outcome. Suddenly, the 3 diplomats started holding hands and jump dancing in a circle, which I found quite ominous for some reason. Then an achievement emerged.
Congratulations! For establishing a peaceful alliance with a bigger power than you have gained the Soft Power perk. Soft Power: influence allies and foes through spreading your culture within their borders and turning their citizens towards viewing your settlement as a nice vacation destination, where they will spend a lot of their hard-earned money and in turn bolster your power and influence in the international struggle between kingdoms and nations.
Now, Vegan started. Let's see if we can't sneak our way into the mountain dungeon. Chapter 45, Dungeon Core Mountain? Hey, would you look at that? It's somehow only half a week prior now. By the ornate mountain dungeon's gate, which stood at the end of a large garden within King Eskilder's castle grounds, were 2 hugely muscular men in sculpted chest armor and helmets made to look like the head of a bear, ears, teeth, snout, and all. Their forearms and legs were left bare, though a short skirt covered the area below their waists. Vegan had used some strange magic that molded the darkness around him, allowing him to traverse up the side of the castle wall, while I'd simply leapt from below and landed within the roughly 7 meters above ground garden. Somehow, the 2 guards had not noticed my landing, even though I flattened a bush with the colossal weight of my vessel. It seemed that their large metal helmets not only muted all sound, but also made it pretty much impossible to see, as they did not notice us until we were right on them, and by then it was too late for them to do anything before I swallowed both whole, devouring even their metal armor. My companion/guide looked at me in a way that was hard for me to discern the meaning of, then said, "I was just going to knock them out." "Oh," I replied. "What kind of stomach does your body have anyway? How did you swallow both that quickly?" I tried a shrug of my toady shoulders, but it mostly just looked like I did a push-up. "I don't know," I told him. "This isn't my real body, and I don't particularly understand how this one was made nor how it's capable of most things." "I see," was all he replied. It seemed obvious that he did not comprehend what I was saying, but it was a convenient way for him to shelve the conversation topic for perpetuity. With the gate cleared of guards, I gave it a good scrutinizing glare. Name: Dungeon Gate. Occupation: Dungeon Gate. Species: Gateus ornaticus blockthewaitis, gate door. Level: 3 of 3. Alignment: locked and idle. Faction: Blazing Blaine's Dungeon. I wondered if Blazing Blaine was the name of the Corps, but knew there was only one way to find out, so I tongue-punched the gate with such force that it shot inward on its hinges when the lock was sheared in half. A powerful echo flowed through the mountain from the concussive force of my strike. "Let's get inside and barricade it behind us," Vagan advised. It seemed a prudent idea, so I hopped beyond the threshold, and once he'd entered as well, I used my tongue to forcefully shove the two sections of the gate back in place, before pulling a heavy stalactite from the ceiling and ramming it into the ground next to the gate, such that it made it impossible to open the gate until removed. Vagan nodded in satisfaction. "They'll need a battering ram to follow us now." "Have you been here before?" I asked. "A few times on the first few floors, but never invited, obviously. My mentor used to bring me here to train." "Floors? Do you not know how dungeons are laid out?" he asked in return. "It seems I don't. Honestly, I'm not quite sure what I expected. Well, it's a bit different from dungeon to dungeon, but they are always comprised of floors. Some go up, some go down. This one goes up. The top floor is supposed to be an open crater at the top of the mountain, you know, like an inactive volcano. How do we get up there?" "You want to go to the top?" he asked with a grin. "Of course. I'll show you the way, but you'll have to do most of the fighting. My skills are generally best served for humans." "Fighting? Yeah? Do you really not know how these things work?" I tried to shrug again, and once again it did not produce a shrug. "This dungeon is full of flame-based monsters, like fire goblins and fire slimes, stuff like that. At the end of each floor is a mini-boss, and on the 6th floor is a proper boss. This pattern supposedly repeats up until the 30th floor, which is where the final boss will be, within the volcano crater." "That seems simple enough," I replied. "I think only a few heroes have managed to reach the summit on floor 30. He cautioned me. "How hard can it be?" With Vagan riding on my back, I hopped eagerly into the first room of the first floor, where a mob of 7 torch-wielding red-skinned goblins attacked me. With a single swipe of my tongue I sent them flying against the walls, where they were turned to paste or buried under falling stalactites. The next 3 rooms were a similar affair, and then came the first mini-boss, who was a hobgoblin called Eric Svensson that wielded a burning wooden club. I tore him apart with a slash of my flensing claws, and he quickly disappeared in a flash fire, leaving behind a few small uncut rubies as reward. The next 2 floors were a variation of the first one, with bigger groups of goblins and the mini-bosses just being an additional hobgoblin, such that floor 3 had 3 of them as the mini-boss. When Vagan had pocketed the rubies that dropped as a reward, I couldn't help but remark, "This design is kind of lazy, isn't it? Even the floor layout is identical." He just shrugged, which I jealously hated him for being capable of, though, thinking back on my life as a toad, shrugging hadn't been something I'd been capable of back then. Rather, It was a mannerism I had picked up from Emma. I considered how much he would have yelled at me by now, if he had been here, but, in a way, I found that I missed his shrill voice and constant whining. "Onward and up!" I announced, when Vagan climbed back onto my vessel. Floor 4 and 5 introduced fire slimes to the mix, but still insisted on using the fire goblins, who were no stronger than the previous floors. The slimes were likewise quite weak, and I couldn't help but let out a groan of annoyance when I found that the mini-boss of the 4th floor was just a hobgoblin riding a slime. "All these slimy slimes and gobby goblins!" I raged. "This core has no pizzazz. It's all just so lazy and uninspired. January 10th. Bad dungeon." A fat red-skinned goblin fell out of the ceiling, then aimed a filthy index finger at me. "Hey, fuck you, buddy! I'm not your buddy, goblin! All you do is complain. It's really rude." I tongue-punched the goblin and sent him flying, but when he hit the wall he just bounced off, seemingly unscathed by the hit. "What I think is rude," I told him, "is making us go through the monotony of this terrible layout. I worked really hard on it," the goblin yelled back. The way he seemed to imply that he was responsible for the dungeon made me immediately use my appraisal on him. Name: Blazing Blaine's Goblin Chief No. 1. Occupation: Dungeon Core Mouthpiece. Species: Flame Goblin. Level: 15 of 15. Alignment: Possessed by Hot-Headed Core. Faction: Blazing Blaine's Dungeon. "You're the Dungeon Core!" I gasped. The goblin stood up and put his hands on his hips. "That's right. Of course, my true form is far too magnificent for you to behold, but you'll also never make it to my final floor." I narrowed my big eyes at him, then said, "I'll come find you and then we'll see who's the better core." My words must have triggered some realization in him, because he quickly used an ability I'd seen Emu utilize many times, the weird bubble between the fingers to create a scope. "How are you level 360? He exclaimed. "You're cheating." Vagan, who had stayed silent this whole time, looked down at me from where he lay atop my back. "No wonder I couldn't tell what level you were, and it explains how you're able to one-shot everything." The goblin mouthpiece went back to pointing at me, and yelled, "BB but yes! Come to my top floor and I'll definitely win. But you won't make it there, 'cause you're weak and gross." Then he pulled down the skin below his right eye and pointed his tongue at me, before disappearing into the floor. "Vagan." "Yes? Now we're definitely going to the top floor. No one challenges me and gets away with it." Chapter 46, The Summit of Monotony? 2 days prior to the events of Chapter 40. I had easily cleared the Floor 6 boss, which was just a very big slime that I fired all my Nashotoads at until it had been entirely devoured, but I did not take a moment to rest on my laurels and thus quickly zoomed through the next 5 floors, which, lo and behold, were basically identical to the first 5, apart from all the goblins having been replaced with hobgoblins and the mini-bosses being worse slime hobgoblins. "You know," Vagan started, "I think you're on to something. This layout is really lazy. You would think that there'd be a bit more variation than just having the layout of the enemies altered slightly. But no, every floor is just 4 rooms in a line, with each room being square and having some braziers for lighting." "I know, right?" I concurred. "I lived in Lillebrunner a lot, and, as I said, I've been to the bottom floors a few times in the past, but I honestly thought there'd be more to this dungeon than this. Let's just keep going. The strategy may be to bore us to death, but I will not succumb to it." In the distance came an echoing voice that said, "Fuck you guys!" The boss fight on floor 12 was comprised of 2 slimes like the one on floor 6 and, as I fired off a barrage of Nashotoads to devour the 2 blobs of slime, I couldn't help but remark tiredly, "If the third boss on floor 18 is 3 of these, then I swear I'll tear down this whole mountain. There's no way the dungeon will be that lazy," Vagan remarked, though I could tell he didn't fully believe himself. floor 13 to 17 were now comprised of worse slime hobgoblins instead of normal hobgoblins, but the boss on floor 13 had me momentarily excited, when it turned out to be a fire-spewing drake. Granted, it still died in a single tongue punch, and the excitement died down when 14 had 2 of them as the mini-boss, and 15 had 3. On floor 16, the mini-boss was a worse slime hobgoblin riding a drake, and the 17th floor boss were 2 of them. As usual, the layout of the rooms was unchanged, as though the dungeon core was literally incapable of coming up with something other than a perfectly square room with equilateral walls, floors, and ceilings. Neither in my life as a toad nor as a settlement core had I met an individual with so little creativity. In a way, ridding the world of their presence was only a boon for all species. I looked at the 3 enormous slimes that greeted us on floor 18. "This is ridiculous," I said. "All right, once we get to the summit, I'm tearing this whole mountain down." "The king might be displeased with you," Vagan replied. "But I think it's the right decision. This place is a den of unimaginative horrors and cookie-cutter aspirations. It deserves to be removed from existence." The next 5 floors were, unsurprisingly, identical to all the ones below, with the worst slime hobgoblins being replaced by drakes. The mini-bosses for floor 19 to 21 were worse slime drakes, which, as a concept, was pretty dumb, as the slimy nature of the worst slime was antithetical to the boiling and evaporating flames of the drake, resulting in a creature that was somehow more dangerous to itself than its surroundings. The mini-bosses on floor 22 and 23 were worse slime hobgoblins riding worse slime drakes. Alright, enough. I give up on narrating the rest of this. Skipping ahead to floor 30, the summit, Vagan and I emerged out into the vast open crater of floor 30, exhausted and ground down by the monotony and utter lack of creativity from the previous 29 floors. "I can't believe we did it," Vagan gasped, the new unfamiliar floor like a breath of fresh air. The 30th floor was quite literally a crater, with the bottom a roundish platform 30 meters in radius, and the surrounding walls all sloping up overhead to where a small aperture let the waning moonlight shine down on us. Granted, it was still the same tired aesthetic of bare exposed mountainous rock, but there were a few partially concealed veins of flowing lava, hinting at the potential that the slumbering volcano was perhaps not as asleep as first expected. A maniacal laughter greeted us, and we looked ahead to the final boss of the imagination-deprived dungeon. I let out a croaking sigh. "Seriously? Yeah, that's very lazy." The boss was an enormous slime, upon which rode a worse slime drake, with the goblin chief sitting at the top and whom the dungeon core, Blazing Blaine, was clearly possessing. With Vagan staying at the stairwell landing, I hopped forward, while the giant slime slowly moved towards me as well. The worst slime drake let out a belch of fire, but not only did it not reach me, it also set itself on fire as well as the giant slime it was riding. To help it die faster, I repeated my tried-and-true strategy of firing off a barrage of gnasher toads, and they quickly got to work devouring the slime from underneath the self-immolating drake and panicking goblin chief. No sooner had the giant slime been devoured whole than I leapt forward with a powerful kick of my toady legs and shot forward a tongue punch that sent both the half-melted worst slime drake and goblin chief flying off into the distance, where they collided with the wall and died in a spectacularly bright flash fire. As the light of the final boss death washed over the crater, a collection of mud huts became revealed, with a big crystal standing in the midst of them all. I hopped over towards the crystal, but then a bunch of goblin chiefs emerged from the huts and tried to fight me off. I was honestly too bored to fight back by then, so I let Vagan take over, as I continued towards the big crystal. It glowed with a warm red light and looked like a cluster of giant rubies that almost formed a crown of sorts. Name: Blazing Blaine. Occupation: Dungeon Master. Species: Dungeon Core Soul Core. Level: 3 out of 5. Alignment: Furious and Frustratingly Stubborn. Faction: Papa Magma and Company. As I observed the crystal, Blazing Blaine's voice emerged from within. All right. You beat me. I'll give you all the rubies and gold and artifacts that I have. Just let me live. You know I can't do that, Blaine, I said coldly. Your dungeon sucks. It's an affront to all dungeon cores, not that I know any, but I'm sure they have more creative designs than yours. What do you want from me? My guiding fairy quit, so I had to figure this all out on my own. That's rough, I told him. But I don't think it excuses your crimes against aesthetics and interior design. You must have been told over and over how boring your dungeon was. So what? I don't listen to haters. Sometimes you have to embrace the hatred and let it flow through you. I counseled wisely. Not all critique is hate, and not all hate is entirely without reason. All right, I'll change. Just don't kill me. How old are you, Blaine? I don't know. Why would I keep track of that? Vagan sidled up next to me, having gotten rid of the many goblin chiefs. He was carrying a sack full of all the loot he had gathered on our way to the summit. Once we got out of here, he'd be probably the richest individual on this part of the continent. This core is at least 300 years old, he said. King Eskilder has been using his fortunes harvested from it to keep himself alive since he first laid claim to it. See, I told Blaine. You've been around all that time and never once changed your ways. You're just a hater, he yelled at me. In response, I tongue-punched his crystal core and broke off a large portion that I promptly swallowed. It only seemed to make him yell more obscenities at me, so I did it again, and again, and again, until no pieces remained of Blazing Blaine's core.
Congratulations! For devouring a soul core like yourself, you have gained the Cannibal Diet perk. Cannibal Diet, devouring a soul core allows you to absorb the core's power and unique properties to use in your own settlement. Depending on the type of core subcategory, you may also unlock unique buildings or minions. Applies retroactively. Congratulations! For devouring the dungeon core known as Blazing Blaine, you unlocked the ability to craft the following structures. Goblin Hut, Hobgoblin Hut, Slime Den, Drake Roost, Magical Species Mixing Mirror, Magical Minion Copying Mirror.
I was about to remark sarcastically how silly it was that I'd gained a structure that allowed me to copy a minion, but then the ground underneath our feet began rumbling and quaking. What's happening? I asked. This is just a theory, Vagan started. But it is quite possible that the dungeon core was keeping the volcano of its mountain dormant, and now that the core is gone, it has begun to erupt, perhaps pent up from many centuries of being forced to stay asleep. Get on my back, I told him hurriedly, immediately accepting his theory as fact, when the stairwell that had led us to the 30th floor exploded in a geyser of destructive lava. With a powerful kick of my toady legs, I shot up at a 45-degree angle and hit the sloping wall of the crater, before kicking off again and flying out through the small hole in the summit. As I landed on the roof of the 30th floor outside, I quickly hopped south towards the city of Lillebrand below, quickly beginning to slide down the slope and picking up tremendous speed. As we were about halfway down the slope, the top of the mountain shot off in a trail of smoke and scalding magma, and we got a perfect view as it landed on the castle below and turned it into a flattened ruin, chunks of the large stones it had been built from shooting out across the city beyond its walls. I quickly leapt from the mountain as we neared the bottom, and sailed across the ruins of the castle, landing somewhere just outside its southernmost walls. But I did not take a moment to rest and continued onward through the city, heading straight for the Pacifists' Guild, while fire and brimstone was raining down on the stoned city. Devastating houses with boulder-sized chunks of mountainous rock that was shot out of the volcano with the speed of a nose-diving kingfisher plummeting into a pond. To catch a fish. Coincidentally, I found the diplomat right as he was ushering his two new wing bear mascot friends into the hut atop the Jackacorn, I'd add. The two bodyguard cavalry looked eager to get out of the city as well, and when they saw me arrive, They quickly croaked orders to the diplomats' mount, and they followed me as I hopped along the main thoroughfare. Standing on a hill a few kilometers outside of Lillebrunner with many displaced citizens, as well as my diplomat and his 2 friends, not to mention Vagan who had held on to my vessel for dear life during our escape, I could not help but marvel at the cataclysmic powers of nature, which, now that I was so far away from the consequences of it, looked rather beautiful. An enormous pillar of black smoke rose from the remains of the mountain, which seemed to have cast off half its mass in the eruption. Bright spots of lava dotted the city at its feet, and a river of magma ran down its blown-open front, engulfing the ruins of the castle, where the mountaintop had landed like a meteor. "Do you think your city has room for all these people?" Vagan asked. "They're not my responsibility," I replied. "I highly disagree. You know what happened last time my toadkin mixed with lesser species." Vagan went silent for a moment, then proposed a solution. "Maybe we can build a place for them right here? That way they won't be homeless, but also won't mix with your citizens, since that seems to be a concern for you." I was about to decline, but then I remembered that one of the requirements for my next evolution was to build a village, a hamlet, and 3 farmsteads beyond the reaches of my castle town. The area on the hill was as good a place as any, so I quickly concentrated on a spot and outcrawled a dozen minions, big-lipped and bug-eyed, but more similar to the displaced citizens of Lillebrunner than my toadkin. The hundreds of citizens looked at my collection of minions as they began to gather materials and construct simple houses, workbenches, and other necessities to begin a simple community. Within 10 minutes, most of the citizens had joined the minions in gathering wood and stone, and followed their lead as they started to build tools and buildings according to the blueprints I'd hastily placed. When the sun started to stain the wilderness outside the walls of the ruined city of Lillebrunner, there stood 5 new farmsteads a few kilometers removed from its still smoldering ruins. Each of these farms were mostly inhabited by the displaced citizens of the ruined city, but a core of a dozen minions in each ensured that the new development of houses followed an orderly fashion. When I returned my spirit to my temporarily abandoned vessel in the first farmstead, I saw that Vagan had somehow reconnected with his mount, Skig. The black-furred jackicorn seemed to have made it out of Lillebrunner unscathed, before finding its rider through unknown means. "I think I'll stay here for a bit," he told me. "I feel partial responsibility for this tragedy, and you know, Lillebrunner was my city too once." "Very well, I told my minions in the farmsteads to listen to your commands, so feel free to order them to do whatever task you deem necessary." "Thank you, I don't think you ever told me your name. My appraising I just said it as Toad, but that can't be right." "No, it's correct, you can call me Toad." "All right. Toad. I'll see you around, I suppose." "Yes. I'll be back." No sooner had the words left the mouth of my vessel than a poof of smoke that smelled of a whole bouquet of flowers mixed with sulfur emerged next to me. As the smoke cleared, I saw an irate Ema standing atop of Goldie, with a bikini-clad woman next to him that I immediately recognized as Jadetta the Missionary of Light, and a strange-looking blue-skinned impish girl with sunglasses. "Toad! What have you done?" "Oh hi, Ema!" I replied cheerfully. Chapter 47, The Final Steps. I hopped back towards my town with Jadetta and the blue-skinned girl with sunglasses on my back. Ema hopped next to me atop Goldie. "So, you're telling me you ate a core because its dungeon was lazily put together?" "That's right," I croaked in reply. "I didn't think it was possible for a core to eat another core," the blue-skinned girl remarked. "I'm Bella Muranthine, by the way, but you can just call me Belle. I'm Toad. I swear, I leave for less than a week and you take that opportunity to do the craziest possible things. I can't leave you out of my sight. You know about my little war and the rebellion too?" I asked. "The what and what?" "Oh, you didn't know. Well, yes, I defeated Earl Sharpie and ate him, then took over his territory. And while I was waging war on him, the non-toadkin in my settlement started a rebellion. I tell you, Building that minion help center and consultation clinic really backfired. Who would have thought that a therapist had the power to brainwash my minions? Emma pinched the bridge of his nose tiredly in response. Did you have a good vacation? No. Judetta, the missionary of the Church of Light, finally spoke up. Sorry, she said. I think I'm doomed to be miserable, Emma remarked. It's all a matter of perspective, Belle told him. Did you all vacation together? I asked, wondering why they had arrived together. Emma sighed. Judetta was trapped in the paradise realm where I landed, and Belle came to find me after you ate that dungeon core. Are you a fairy too? I asked the blue-skinned imp. Bella Muranthine adjusted the sunglasses on her big nose, while wiggling her crescent-shaped ears playfully. I am indeed a guiding fairy, although, like our dear Emma, I am not a miling, but rather ignis fatuus. And how do you know each other? Emma was my guiding fairy when I was a core. I used my appraisal on her. Name, Bella Muranthine. Occupation, guiding fairy. Species, ignis fatuus slew. Level unknown. Alignment, Gideon Fiery. Faction, Papa Magma and Company. You work for Papa Magma? Who's that? One of Deathheim's competitors, Emma remarked coldly. Emu is just jealous because our upward mobility is better, and we get more vacations and autonomy. What kind of core were you? I asked. In the distance we could see the enormous weeping oak and the treeline of my forest. I had the fire element, and had a dungeon that the humanoids around me called the Hell Pit. It was pretty popular for strong adventurers to delve into, but none of them ever made it to my bottommost floor, and eventually I amassed enough experience to evolve the final time. That was when Papa Magma scouted me. He loves fire elementals, you see, so most of such cores that undergo their final evolution usually work for him. Hardly any do make it to that point, Emma joked. Why not? He did a strange gesture of folding his hands and then moving them out and away from each other, while making a boom sound with his mouth. I turned one of my eyes to look at Belle, who was sitting on my forehead. Is that true? Belle took one of her blue ears in her hands and rubbed it absent-mindedly. We have a certain personality type that usually leads towards self-destruction, it's true. But it's only like 75%. That's pretty bad, I commented. You're one to talk, Emma replied sharply. I still remember when the mortality rate to dehydration was close on 90% amongst your minions. Emma is defending me, Belle mumbled starry-eyed. He's never done that before. I'm not defending you. You fire elementals are trouble and you know it, but Toad is a uniquely terrifying example of how not to manage your people. It's so much better now, I argued. Really? Emma asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. Yeah. Ever since all the non-Toadkin were executed for their rebellion, there's only about 12 deaths per day. Emma sighed in disappointment, but I ignored him and continued talking to Belle. Since Papa Magma likes fire elementals, does that mean that Blazing Blaine, the core I ate, was favored by him? Not just favored, Belle told me. Papa Magma loved that idiot. Really? Yeah. So he's upset with me? Kind of, yep. It's just another deity to the list, Emma joked darkly. We're up to 3 now. I don't think Deathheim dislikes me, I replied. You're right. He hates you. Ah. We made it to my castle town just as the sun was beginning to vanish behind the mountains in the horizon. As we passed through the gate, Belle jumped off my back and 2 strange wiry wings of bright orange flames emerged on her back and she flew ahead. Why can't you do that? I asked Emu. Next time you evolve I'll finally gain something similar to it. About time too. Normally I would already have my unique abilities, but it's far more drawn out with your kind of progression. Speaking of progression, I replied, what does my evolution checklist look like? Emu waved a hand in the air and text emerged from his encyclopedia to the air in front of me. Evolution requirements. Castle town to capital. Build 3 farmsteads, 1 hamlet, and 1 village within your territory and ensure they are self-sufficient. Build 1 siege factory and craft engines of war, and utilize your beast inventor workshop to also construct beasts of war by combining beasts with siege engines. You actually did a lot while I was gone, Amy remarked with quite a lot of surprise in voice. Why does it say I still need to make war beasts? I've already made several. Did you make any by combining Siege's engines with them? I thought about it for a moment, then realized that I actually hadn't used the Siege factory once, as the harness I had made for the diplomat's jackacorns hadn't actually used the building. We know what you have to do now then, he continued. It took a few hours, but then the Siege engine builder and his team produced a sleek ballista that could fire stakes of stone, iron, or wood from one end of my town to the other. As I was looking for a suitable animal to combine with the newly constructed ballista, my mad scientist came over to where I'd parked my shell and banged on it a few times, until I sent my essence back into it, and turned to regard him. Look what I found! He announced excitedly, holding aloft a hedgehog that definitely did not enjoy being picked up as it kept squeaking angrily. It's perfect, I told him, and within a minute, a team of builders had hauled the ballista into the strange domed beast workshop. As they left, the mad scientist took the hedgehog inside and the gate closed behind them. There followed more angry squeaking, followed by the sound of projectiles flying back and forth through the air. Then the hexagonal plates of the dome lit up and smoke started billowing out the hole in the top of the dome. Moments later, the gate sprang open and the mad scientist ran out with his new creation following on his heels, angrily snapping its mouth at him, but failing to catch him. Halt! The beast stopped in its tracks immediately, and I got to have a proper look at it. Name: Nibbles. Occupation: War Beast. Species: Ballista Hedgehog Chimera. Level: 55 of 100. Alignment: Angry that it was dragged out of its nest where it was hibernating, but now feeling rather splendid thanks to growing several times its normal size and gaining awesome powers. Faction: Toad Town. There wasn't much change about the hedgehog, other than its tremendous growth from a 20-centimeter tall critter to a towering 3-meter tall unit of a creature. Its spine had become a lot more flexible, as shown by Nibbles' perpetual flexing of them back and forth, and as I looked closer at them, each of them had the shape of the projectiles the siege builder had test-fired across my city. Nibbles. Release a volley of ballista at the tree leaned to the east. Obligingly, Nibbles flexed his spines forward and fired row upon row, starting with the frontmost, of devastating stakes of hardened keratin, which pulverized about 30 trees by the time the final volley landed. You went a bit overboard, I told him. But enthusiasm is good. Ema came hopping over a couple of minutes later. Toad, something happened to some of the woodchoppers harvesting in the east, their bodies were totally. He froze as he saw the ballista hedgehog with smoke coming out of hundreds of empty holes in its back. Oh, for hell's sake! Excuse me? What am I supposed to do? How long has she been hanging on to your back? Ema asked me as he noticed Judetta perched on the back of my vessel. I didn't realize you were still there, I told her. But we could use more preachers for my new religion. In one movement she had leapt from my back and landed in front of me, hands on her hips. I'll do it. You can definitely count on me to spread your good word. I cast a sidelong glance to Emu, but his head was buried in his hands. Welcome aboard, Judetta. Thank you, Your Toadness. I was pretty certain she had somehow lost her mind, but then again, Ema did say she had been forgotten by her goddess in a paradise realm for who know how long. Chapter 48 Godlike Appraisal? I spent several hours flying around in my essence form to supervise the continued growth of my 5 farmsteads, 2 of which had turned into hamlets, and 1 of which was on the brink of becoming a village. And then it happened. The invisible threshold was crossed and the final requirement for my evolution to capital was fulfilled. At the speed of lightning, My essence was sucked back towards my castle town, and the core that hid within the enormously overgrown weeping oak.
Congratulations! For evolving into a capital, your list of buildings available has expanded and all the unclaimed territory between your captured and self-sufficient settlements has been added to your domain. Additionally, you are now able to establish towns anywhere within your territory.
Warning: every ruler of your settlements has now been added to the Toad Kingdom. Only one can become king, and as such the rulers are now actively scheming to defeat each other. Announcement: Appraisal: Perk has been evolved into Godlike Appraisal. Announcement: Mind Reader: Perk has been evolved into Soul Reader. I flew out of my core, which was now the size of a boulder yet somehow still smaller than Blazing Blaines had been, then entered my large toad vessel. A blob like tar or spilled ink appeared next to me, and out of it jumped Emu astride Goldie. When he landed, the blob disappeared. "How'd you do that?" "That's my movement ability," he announced. "I can manifest shadows and use them like portals, allowing me to move great distances in an instant, and I can bring other people with me. That'll be handy for when the Church of Light's crusade comes within range of our territories," I remarked. "We can move our armies around them with ease." "Wait, what?" "Oh, right, you didn't see it 'cause you were on vacation at the time. But the church sent a crusade when I took over Earl Sharpie's lands and turned all his churches to Toad-Dom. I knew that Toad Idol perk was bad news," he replied. I was elated to finally have a more powerful appraisal perk now, and eagerly wanted to try it out. Somehow sensing this, Emu regarded me sharply. "You have to be careful with your new appraisal. If not given specific commands, you'll end up." At the same moment, a pair of wagons rolled into town, and I used my godlike appraisal on the rightmost one to try and figure out where it had come from. Warning: activating unrestricted godlike appraisal. Wayne's Wayne. Species: Plostrum ligneum. Level: January 1st. Age: 4 in human years, 287 in wagon years. Gender: male. Weight: 272 kilos, 1059 with current haul. Spouse: Callie's caboose. Plane of existence: the mundane realm. Continent: Malbia. Country of origin: Lemon. Hometown: Heckenfeld. Made from timber from the oak trees of the hard black forest, and iron nails and bracings from the ore of the Heckenfeld quarry. Dimensions: 6.5 m long and 3 m wide and 1.5 m tall. Best friend: Doctor's Dre. Biggest fears: termites and children with greasy fingers. Fetishes: wagon on cart play. Favorite meals: oil wash. Medical problems: dislocated third and fourth spinal timber planks carrying a haul of quarried stones a year back. Front left wheel squeaks when it rains. A family of beetles have moved into the rear hinge compartments, and their gnawing is producing a near-constant itch, and rust has started forming along the back axle. Political alignment: center middle. Occupation: Wayne the merchant's wagon. Dream occupation: horse racing wagon. Faction: Heckenfeld Merchants Guild. Attributes: strength 23, dexterity 8, constitution 18, intelligence 1, wisdom 1, charisma 2, gear: high quality quarried stone, x 400 kilograms. High quality iron ore deposits, x 200 kilograms. Wayne, x 92 kilograms. Assorted uncut gems, x 80 kilograms. Assorted jewelry tools, x 15 kilograms. Abilities: Big Haul passive. Enables Wayne to carry a maximum haul of 850 kilograms. Seasoned Veteran passive. Due to Wayne's long service as a transport wagon, he moves moderately faster down roads he has traveled before. System achievements: married, Awarded for marrying Callie's caboose. Makes Wayne's Wayne 4.789% less adventurous and decreases the chance of unfortunate random encounters by 0.042%. Backstory. Once upon a time. Alright, that's enough, Amy yelled, having performed some kind of spell to halt the godlike appraisal. We were just getting to the good part, I replied. I wanted to know how Wayne and Caboose met. See, this is why godlike appraisal is dangerous. You end up suddenly caring about everything, because you can read their entire history, and before you know it, 2 decades have passed by. Why does that sound like personal experience? Shut up, that's why. Anyway, can you show me my next evolution requirements? You'll have to wait until next chapter for that. Don't be that way. It's too much neatly organized text for one day, Toad. Fine. Chapter 49, System Enforced Reconciliation? I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as Emu showed me the list of requirements for my next evolution. Not only were the requirements absurdly arduous and hyperspecific, but they also went against all my careful planning for my settlement and its beautiful people. You colluded with the system to make these, I complained to Emu. As if I had that kind of power, he remarked humorlessly. Besides, these requirements were more or less set in stone since the beginning. Then why didn't you tell me? Well, our genius system decided to make it impossible for me to reveal stuff, so... I let out a trilling croak sigh. I couldn't believe it, as I stared at the words that floated in the air, which had startled the many non-minions people who had taken up residence in my city, nay, capital, as of late. They were eagerly murmuring amongst each other, wondering what they were seeing. Can they read this? I wondered out loud. Of course not. Phew. The revelation of what I was required to undertake would no doubt spark a second rebellion if my minions found out. Evolution requirements. Capital to nation. Have at least 10 species thriving with your territory. Create a lasting peace between toadkin and frogkind. Evolve a lord to king after one is chosen by popular vote, as decided upon by the denizens of your territory. Have 3 generations of royalty born under your king's lineage. Defeat the crusade of the Church of Light. Spread the Toadom religion to neighboring nations. Create a national diet of elected citizens to advise the king on laws and governance, such that the will of the people is included in his rule. Take over 3 cities of castle-town rank or higher, either through warfare or diplomacy. Make at least 10 million token in profit from sales within or without your territory. Find a relic of divine power. Conjure a national guardian by combining a rare animal with a divine relic and infusing it with your essence. Build a graveyard and evolve a gravekeeper. How am I even supposed to facilitate peace talks between toads and frogs, when we are so evolved and they're still hopping around in ponds and whatnot? Well, actually, a few frogs have already naturally evolved into humanoids. What? When? Ages ago. They beat toads by a few centuries at least. Nonsense! That cannot be! Emu looked poised to argue back, but then it hit me. It was those damned princesses and wizards. They turned the frogs into princes, didn't they? I'm not sure that's how it went, but let's just say some wizards were no doubt involved. Your kind would never have hopped out of the ponds and gained sentience otherwise. You take that back. What's the big deal anyway? Emu said. Toads and frogs are basically the same. I can't believe what I'm hearing, I replied. All this time you've been a vile speciesist, who treats all other species like scum. At the risk of repeating myself, look who's talking. I refuse to follow this sick demand of a clearly twisted system. Don't you want to evolve? Screw this. You don't mean that. I most definitely do. Watch me, I told him, then began hopping away. Emu quickly ran over to me and jumped on my back, holding on tight. Toad! You have to evolve! I don't want to be stuck like this forever. Please. Absolutely not. I cried and leapt from the ground, taking the chubby fairy with me as I sailed across my city, many of the non-minions looking up as I flew across the sky, before plummeting back down into the Eastern District, with all its industry of war and disparate living conditions. As though led there by the scheming hand of fate, we happened to land directly in front of a weird-looking minion. Minion! I ordered. Get this fat fairy off my back. The minion did not move a hair, but just continued staringly dumbfounded at us. What's wrong with you? I yelled at him using my voice. Get this chubby bastard off me! It took the minion another second of hesitation before he moved towards me, but by then Ima had already gotten off by himself and was laughing hysterically. He swiped his hand through the air and a blob of shadow appeared beside him, bringing Goldie to his side from wherever she had been waiting in the city. What's so funny? I yelled in anger, feeling very mocked. And in front of a minion no less. Look at him! Like, really look! I turned towards the minion that Ima was pointed at, then narrowed my eyes. Warning: activating unrestricted godlike appraisal. No! You goddamn Edie! Fred Frog's son. Species: frog kind. Level: 12 out of 100. Age: 32. Gender: male. Weight: 68 kilos, 74 with current equipment. Relationship status: involuntarily single. Plane of existence: the mundane realm. Continent: Malbia. Country of origin: lemon. Hometown: Lillebrunner. Made from: rubbery skin, lean flesh, and moderately dense bones, plus all the extra gubbins inside that no one really cares about when looking at you. Dimensions: 1.6 m tall and 0.7 m wide. Best friend: no one. Fred Frog's son is friendless. Biggest fears: toads, salt, and pigeons. Fetishes: latex. Favorite meals: fly soup and mosquito barbecue. Medical problems: sore left wrist, starving, malnourished, and hyperflexible ankles prone to sprains. Political alignment: neoconservatism. Occupation: jobless vagrant. Dream occupation: rose gold adventurer. Faction: frog-kind for governmentally enforced marriages to promote a sustainable birth rate of the frog-kind species. Attributes: strength: 6. Dexterity: 15. Constitution: 5. Intelligence: 6. Wisdom: 4. Charisma: 4. Gear: stash of erotic novels, x 3 kilograms. Backpack, x 1.2 kilograms. Simple hemp sandals, x 700 grams. Simple linen trousers, x 600 grams. Simple linen shirt, x 500 grams. Abilities: frog reflexes passive. Due to Fred Frogson's frog-kind heritage, he has a boost of +8 to his dexterity attribute. Repulsive passive. Due to Fred Frogson's disgusting appearance, odor, and mannerisms, all potential partners find him repulsive. System achievements: forever alone. Awarded for living past the age of 30 without ever touching a potential partner. Permanent reduction of -5 charisma. Backstory: once upon a time, Fred Frogson was born to Carl and Melinda Frogson. Nothing much happened during his life as a shut-in living with his parents in Lillebrunner, until suddenly the mountain exploded and Fred's parents finally decided to kick him out of their house, though their house also lay in ruins, which made it pretty straightforward. Fred's parents went on to live happily ever after. Fred Frogson is currently in Toad Town looking for a job so he can afford to eat and not rely on rainwater and grass for sustenance. Huh, Ama remarked. I let the appraisal run its course, but this guy really doesn't have a lot going for him, huh? Don't speak about Fred like that, I yelled, tears somehow streaming down below the bulbous eyes of my vessel. He's just a misunderstood weirdo. He's a frog too. Yeah, well, frogs before fairies. I'm below frogs now, Emma replied. He rolled his shoulders with a sigh. Huh. I actually don't care how you view me. Now get to making peace with your archenemies already. Fred! I yelled, the frog-kind man startling with a rib-biting yelp. Yes, weird-looking toad machine? You can call me Toad. I would rather not. Listen here, Freddy. I started. We're gonna get your life back on track, and show this system that it shouldn't mess with us amphibians and label us as scum, just because its perception of beauty is clearly speciest. Really? He asked, looking up at my towering form. He was rather small. Even most token were a head above him, but then again, it was a fitting contrast, as toads also towered over frogs. We're gonna find you a wife, Fred. Mark my words. Ribbit. It's finally happening. Thank you, God. You're welcome, I replied, hopping closer to him. But first, you've got to get me in contact with the figureheads of your species. Who would have thought that all it took to establish peace between toads and frogs was arranged marriages? Emma remarked. After all the fuss you made about your irreconcilable differences, I thought that maybe it would be more complicated than this. It was always about the wives, Emma. Those slick frogs used to steal ours and we used to steal theirs in turn, I said. I suppose frog women aren't too bad on the eyes, I added. Emma looked like he was about to throw up. They're not as bumpy and warty as toad women, I continued. They're really smooth, you know. Please, no more, he pleaded, a hand over his mouth. It had only taken a few days after meeting Fred Frogson before I had met with the democratically elected ruler of frogkind, Lars Frogson, Fred's older brother. He was the only of the roughly 48 bachelor frog-kind men who had a job and a steady girlfriend, and as such he was deemed the superior specimen to lead the rest out of their devasting singlehood. After using my godlike appraisal on Lars Frogson, I had figured out that all the frog-kind really sought were relationships, and thus I had scouted single human women across my settlement, and propositioned them with the idea of blindly marrying men they had never met, and who belonged to a different species. The frog-kind men and human women had met in my capital city at Viola's buffet, and surprisingly, the women had seemed fairly interested in the men, despite the obvious lack of traits which made toadkin males far more appealing. But then, who was I to question governmentally organized and sponsored love? Chapter 50 Mr. Popular? Quest, hippity-hop to the polls. Type Democratic vote. Required adventurer rank none. Duration 7 days. Reward, I voted iron pin badge. Description, a king must be selected from the available candidates. Let your voices be heard and vote for the person you deem most fitting to rule all of Toad Town and its territories. Are you aware that there are more than 2 candidates? Emma asked. What do you mean? Isn't it just my 2 lords who can become king? The wording of the evolution requirement would suggest that, yes, but in actuality, no. Literally anyone in your territory can become king. Oh. Yeah. Who are the candidates then? Lord Toadscander, Lord Toadus, Vagan the Adventurer, Viola the Buffet Wizard, Toecaller, El the Jackicorn, Goddard the Flesh Crafter, Requiem for a Frog the Executioner's Scythe, and Judetta the Toad-Down Preacher. Are you croaking me? Yes, so another thing it seems I'm allowed to reveal now. Once someone is made king, they basically get as much power of governing your settlement as you do, so... That's really bad. We have to antagonize the voters and get the rightful person elected king. I hate to say this, but for once I agree. If Toadus isn't made king, then I don't know what will happen to this place. You mean Toadscander? He's clearly the better lord of the two. Don't be silly, Toady. Of course that wimpy lordling isn't worthy of actually being king. Toad Town needs a firm ruler, and only Toadus can provide that. I mean, he's already evolved past Toadkin and become a Toadkin tyrant. He's basically made for the job. And with all the fighting we'll need to do, you want someone like that at the helm. I can't believe what I'm hearing, I remarked offendedly. Eamon narrowed his eyes. I guess we'll be on opposite sides until a king has been chosen, he said ominously. You're going down, I warned him. Might makes right, he replied. When my team Toadus wins this election, you'd better kowtow at my feet and tell me how amazing I am. Ha! When my team Toadscander wins, you'll have to do whatever I say for a week. Deal! I narrowed my bulbous eyes. Deal! I replied before hopping my separate way to find Lord Toadscander. Over the course of the next week, Ema and I fought a proxy war with minions and adventurers as our soldiers. No lives were actually lost, apart from one guy named Jack, who slipped on a discarded banana peel and brained himself on the lip of my wishing well. With my minions I minted wagonfuls of tokens to bribe voters with so that they would vote for Toadscander. As a result of all the newly minted coins, however, the price of bread rose by 20,000%, and one of my clever merchant minions had to step in to fix the situation, before another riot was caused, though this meant that a new gang of minions had to be sent around to rob all the bribed voters of their coins, so that they could be removed from circulation. Ema seemed to be going the route of having Toadus men intimidate voters by standing around the barrels used for votes to be deposited into, telling voters who to vote for, or else they might suddenly become the victim of a very unrelated hyper-violent attack. However, since Ema was in charge of that operation, he didn't actually go through with it, which quickly resulted in people just ignoring the threats. Some candidates, like Viola and Vagan, were actively discouraging people from voting on them, while others, like Goddard the Fleshcrafter and Jadetta my new preacher, were trying to influence voters in their own ways. Jadetta promised voters that, if she was elected to king, they would be showered in divine love by me, their god. Granted, I was unsure if Jadetta even knew that the object of Toaddom worship was me, but it didn't seem to matter to her. Goddard, who was still under arrest but had turned the jail into a new laboratorium, was using his newly crafted puppets and creatures to attempt to blend in amongst the citizens and using them to cast votes. When I discovered this, though, I had cavalrymen stationed around the voting booths, alongside sharpshooters on overwatch, such that any non-humanoid was quickly dispatched. I did try to use my command of my minions to sway their votes, but it seemed that an effect of the democratic vote was that it disabled any of my direct interference with how the ballots were cast. At the end of the 7th day, Emu and I met on neutral ground, Viola's buffet. We sat on opposite sides of a table, him on a stool and me on the ground cause I was too big and heavy for a chair. So, Amos started. So, I replied, equally tense. Viola came walking over and noticed us at one of her tables. Are you ready to order yet? She asked, somehow not worried about potentially being elected king of all my lands. I can't eat anything, I'm too nervous, I said. Me too, Ema concurred. About what? She asked. Also, why are you here if you're not hungry? About the election, obviously, we said in unison. Wait, why? The results are already in? What? Yeah, didn't you see? Toe-Collar won, by a landslide too. Ema and I shared a long look at each other. Fuck, he then said. At least it wasn't the executioner's side that won, I replied. I guess. So? Are you gonna eat or are you gonna get the hell out so the table can be used by actual diners? I suddenly have an appetite again, I announced. Me too, Ema said sheepishly. Viola was kind of terrifying. For some reason, her buffet felt like it lay outside my jurisdiction over the combined territories of Toad Town, as though an inviolable island in the sea of my essence. After finishing our meal, Ema and I found Toadcaller hiding within his hermit's lodge by the roots of the great weeping oak. Come on, Toadcaller, you were made king, so you have to live in the castle now. Toadscander might not be happy to have a roommate and boss, but he lost, so he doesn't get a say. Toadcaller was struggling quite a lot, so I had to swallow him to be able to get him out of his dirt hovel. As I left the lodge, I prepared for a powerful leap from the foot of the castle's outer wall and up to its top, but just as I was about to kick off from the ground itself became soft and pliable, and I fell through it, emerging within the throne room of the castle, spat out by the ground. That was very uncomfortable, I told Ema, who had teleported me using his magic. Please don't do that again. Where's the Toadcaller? He asked, ignoring my demand. I quickly spat out the shell-shocked man and he quickly crawled away to hide behind the throne. Wow, he really doesn't want this, I said. I can't believe you swallowed him. All right, don't move, I told the Toadcaller, who of course immediately started running for the gate leading out of the throne room. I lanced him through with my essence, like lightning from a cloudless sky, and he quickly fell to his knees, as his body grew and took on a different shape, becoming something closer to Toadscander in appearance, although he retained his malformed human-like face, still not receiving any of the trademark visual signs of his heritage. As his evolution finalized, a puff of smoke emerged from his shining golden figure and utterly obscured him from sight. Then a moment later, he strode from the cloud towards the throne at the other end of the room. He had grown to nearly 3 meters in height and his body was now covered in emerald scales, his very eyes glowing with the same awe-striking hue, and hardened keratin having formed on the brow of his face, creating a ridge that looked very much like a crown. From the back of his head fell a curtain of luscious amber-red hair. As he sat down upon the throne, splaying his sculpted and perfect body across it, I inspected him with a limited appraisal, which Ema had taught me to do so that I didn't get lost in reading through everyone's backstory and medical history. Name: John Toadcaller I. Occupation: King of Toad Town. Species: Toadkin royalty. Level: 50 of 500. Alignment: Chaos Incarnate. Faction: Toad Town Kingdom. His name is John? Seriously? It could have been worse, I replied. It could have been Kevin. Yeah, I don't think I could respect a king named Kevin, but John is just so bland. John Toadcaller I cleared his throat and then said his first declaration as King of Toad Town. I want to pet the Hydra Goose. Oh no. What? I asked. He somehow has the power to add evolution requirements. Look. This just appeared. Evolution requirements. Capital to nation. Find the honking calamity Hydra Goose so that John Toadcaller I, King of Toad Town, can pet it. That's not good, I said. Understatement of the century. I guess we have to find the Hydra Goose then. Fuck. End of chapter. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like and comment to let me know you want more. Make sure to support the author by liking the official story page on Royal Road, link in the description. Links to the author's Discord group or Patreon can also be found in the description.